Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Fred Levin was one of the most successful lawyers in American history. Even after his death on January 12, 2021, he remains a largely misunderstood man. His life's story is proof that fact is often stranger than fiction. But what do you really know about Fred Levin's life? The truth is far more interesting than the fantasy. So today's episode will be a recording of an interview with Josh Young, who wrote Fred Levin's biography. I did the interview in 2014 when the book was released. So in it, we speak of Fred in present tense. But is that the wrong tense to use today? Perhaps not. Because Fred Levin is still alive, in myth and in legend. Let's listen to that interview. We're going to talk this hour about Fred Levin. Fred Levin, the man, the lawyer, the myth, the legend, the humanist, the cockroach. Yes, you heard me right. If you think you know Fred Levin, trust me, you don't. Unless you've read Josh Young's book already, you do not know Fred Levin. Well, I have read the book cover to cover, and it's a great story, and we're going to be talking about that this hour with Josh Young, who has written the book, And Give Up Showbiz, How Fred Levin Beat Big Tobacco, Avoided 2 Murder Prosecutions, Became a Chief of Ghana, Earned Boxing Manager of the Year, and Transformed American Law. Even if you think you know him, you don't, unless you've read this book, And Give Up Showbiz. It really is a fascinating read. So let's go on this journey together and learn more about Fred Levin, the man, the myth, the cockroach. Prior to reading this book, I had always thought that Fred Levin was a really smart guy who got straight A's in school, went to law school, lucked out by getting a big railroad personal injury case, and then wisely invested his winnings into a big law firm that turned out to be successful. Why? Because he had a bunch of money from the railroad win. Ha! Wow. What I did not know about Fred Levin. Josh, this was a fascinating read.
Well, thank you. I attribute that to having a fascinating and multidimensional subject.
Well, he certainly is that. And like I said a moment ago, I thought I knew the story about Fred Levin, but I didn't. There was so much in this book that was completely new to me. And I do want to get into that. But first, let me ask you this. Whose idea was it to write this book?
The book was my idea. I'd been looking to do a book on a trial lawyer. I lived 3 blocks from where Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered in Los Angeles and watched that trial unfold and Johnny Cochran win that case with great fascination. Going back much further when I was younger, F. Lee Bailey was one of my idols, on the level of a John Havlicek of the Celtics or a Bob Greasy of the Dolphins. For me, it was F. Lee Bailey. So I'd always had this fascination, but I couldn't really identify somebody to do this book on. I was having drinks with Wayne Rogers in Los Angeles, who played Trapper John on MASH and is now a multifaceted businessman. We wrote a book together entitled Make Your Own Rules, and Wayne said, I have a place down in Destin, and over in Pensacola, there's this wily old devil named Fred Levin, and you might want to look into him. And so he started ticking off some of Fred's accomplishments. The University of Florida Law School is named after him. He was named Boxing Manager of the Year. He's in the Boxing Hall of Fame. He's in the Trial Lawyers Hall of Fame. He's a Chief of Ghana. I said, yeah, that's all neat. And he's rich. Yeah, he's rich. He said, but he's one of the most controversial people you'll ever meet. The Florida bar tried to disbar him 3 times. There were 2 murder-suicides, one a murder-suicide and one a murder that people think down there think he was involved in. And he's just one of the most colorful people you'll ever meet. I said, great. If you get me an introduction, I'll go down and talk to him and see if I can talk him into doing this.
Well, that's really interesting because when I heard that the book was coming out, I thought to myself, oh, this is vanity press. Fred Levin hired some intern to write a book about him and tell his life story. But that's actually not at all what happened. You're a 5-time New York Times bestselling author, and you approached Fred.
That's exactly right. I've written 16. This is my 16th book, and have been fortunate enough to have those 5 New York Times bestsellers. But it's really finding the subject. And what came out of the process, and the reason I got Fred at the exact right time, his wife had recently passed away, And as Socrates said, an unexamined life is not worth living. And so Fred Levin, who never stopped for 1 second to take a look at his life and what he had done, not in terms of his accomplishments, which he looked at all the time, but how it had affected his family and how they had suffered for his success. And so I walked in at that exact moment, and I think that's why he was willing to do the book.
So let's talk about Fred, Josh. With all the success that Fred had in his life, I mean, a successful lawyer, he must have been a straight-A student throughout all his years in school, right?
Absolutely not. When Fred attended the University of Florida, he was a doofus, naughty-by-nature partier. He didn't miss a party. He didn't miss a football game. You never saw him without a drink in his hand or a cigarette in his hand. And when he graduated, he had a 2.0. He barely had a 2.0. He had to go to summer school to raise his average to a 2.0 so he could get into law school. Now, this is back in the days when law school admitted anyone who wanted to go, and then they just simply flunked out a fifth of the class along the way. So Fred's sitting there thinking, I'm having a great time here. This is outstanding. How can I get 3 more years of this? So he calls his dad. He says, Daddy, I want to go to law school and be a lawyer like my brother. His dad says, that's fine. Well, Fred gets into law school. He shows up on the first day, and everybody knows his reputation precedes him. Everybody knows Fred Levin, the partier, the moron. And the dean says, look to your left, look to your right. Those 2 guys aren't going to be here in 3 years when you graduate. And a light went off in Fred's head, and he said, oh, my God, I better take this seriously. I got to start working. And so for 3 years, Fred Levin didn't go to a football game, didn't go to a party. All he did was study. And he ended up graduating 3rd in his class. Would have been first. Only 2 students transferred in the senior year who beat him, and went on to join his brother in the law practice. 360 original students in the class, only 60 made it through. So his life was really turned around when he found and learned to love the law.
He stays in Gainesville to party, and he ends up taking law seriously and becoming one of the most successful lawyers in the history of the United States. Josh, I've had a lot of close Jewish friends since grade school, and I've never understood the reasons for anti-Semitism. I was very surprised in the book at all the obstacles that Fred Levin faced just because he was Jewish. But he seemed to always come out on top almost because of anti-Semitism that was against him. How so?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. Anti-Semitism, really ironically became the cornerstone of his success and the driving force in his life. And rather than holding him down, it actually caused him to rise up probably to greater heights than he would have. He grew up at a time in the South when there was deep racial prejudice. The courtroom had a bathroom for blacks and a bathroom for whites. The Jews in Pensacola weren't allowed to join the country club. When he went to the University of Florida, he wanted to join the most popular sorority. Well, the Jews weren't allowed to do that. And as a consequence of that, he sort of allied himself with the African Americans' cause. And he came around to the fact that if you treat everybody the same and you fight for the little guy, that you're fighting for yourself as well. And that really drove him all the way up until the present day. Even when the law school, and he paid the money to have the law school named after him, there were people were upset because it was A, Fred Levin, and B, because he was Jewish. A lot of these silk-stocking corporate lawyers didn't like that. One of the greatest ironies to being Jewish is when he started practicing law in 1961 with his brother, they went into personal injury law because they couldn't get the banks and big businesses to let them represent them because they were Jewish. So they start out practicing law that nobody wants to practice, taking slip and fall cases. Well, over the next 10 years, this becomes very lucrative and big. So by the time personal injury law explodes, they were there first. They knew how to do it, and they knew how to win the big cases. So the irony is, he probably would have been, if he would have been Catholic, he probably would have been a tax lawyer, and we wouldn't be talking about him today.
So how did Fred manage to get the University of Florida College of Law to be named after him, the Frederick G. Levin College of Law? How did he pull that off?
It's a classic Fred Levin story. When Fred Levin does well, everybody does good, but there's always controversy in the wake. After he orchestrated the tobacco settlement and earned, by his count, including what his firm took, about $300 million, the dean of the University of Florida Law School came to him, and they were trying to get one of his friends to give $5 million to name the new building after him. and they wanted Fred to call this friend and try and talk him into it. And over drinks, the dean says, well, hell, tell him if he gives $10 million, we'll name the whole law school after him. So Fred sat back and he said, this is interesting. He said, all these lawyers who have fought me, these corporate lawyers, all their life, who don't like me, I can put my name on this law school. That's where their sons, their grandsons, their great-grandsons are going to go to law school. And when they come up to graduation, my damn name's going to be on that diploma. So after about 5 minutes of thinking about this, and he was going to give most of this money away anyway, he said, I'll give the $10 million. Put my name on the law school.
And there was quite a bit of controversy after that happened, right?
Yeah, there was actually letters flew back and forth between lawyers, and they were appalled that Fred Levin's name was going to be on this law school because he was a flamboyant self-promoter, always in front of a TV camera, taking out ads, had to have the biggest house, the fastest car, always promoting himself, and that engendered a lot of hatred toward him and jealousy, and they couldn't believe that this revered institution was going to bear his name. There was even a bill introduced in the Senate, didn't go anywhere, to refund his money and have his name taken off the law school. Ultimately, the $10 million gift was matched by state law, so the law school got $20 million, and it really allowed the law school to transform itself, to grow, and to get through troubled financial times. But the fallout was immense. The dean of the law school ended up having to leave the university over the controversy, and ultimately the president of the university left as well.
Well, I thought that entire chapter was hilarious in a Les Miserables, Valjean versus Javert kind of way, where the oppressed good guy ultimately prevails over the oppressor through sheer goodness and decency. I knew the outcome, but I was cheering Fred on that entire chapter. I loved it.
Fantastic. He, as he says, my name will be on that law school forever. There's nothing anyone can do about it. Doesn't like it.
All right. I do want to get into his adult life as a lawyer, but before we do that, let me address one more thing about his youth. Fred learned to break, or at least to bend the rules at a very early age. Tell us the story about David Koblovich and the very brief basketball championship that Fred enjoyed.
Well, there was a young youth basketball team, and they wanted to win the championship, but they didn't have the right personnel for the team. They needed an extra player. So Fred drafted a boy into the basketball team who was 4 or 5 years too old. They go on, they win the championship, and of course they figure out, because this kid has facial hair, he's not 12 years old. They investigate, they get to the bottom of it, and it turns out that Fred Levin put him up to this and put the team up to that, so they stripped the championship from them.
And then he got caught again cheating in the YMCA league.
Virtually the exact same story. He was always trying to cut the corner so he could win, and he would bend the rules, as he would say, without really breaking them. I think later in life that was certainly something that he stopped doing after he grew up and saw that that really wasn't going to get him very far.
Mm-hmm. All right, we got to take a quick break here. We're talking to Josh Young. He's the author of a fascinating book about Fred Levin titled "And Give Up Showbiz: How Fred Levin Beat Big Tobacco, Avoided 2 Murder Prosecutions, Became a Chief of Ghana, Earned Boxing Manager of the Year, and Transformed American Law." We'll address Fred Levin's adult career when we get back. This is Mike Bates. With me on the phone is Josh Young, the author of the book "And Give Up Showbiz." It's about Fred Levin, and it's a fascinating read. I encourage you to get it. So, Josh, let me ask you a question about Fred Levin's adult career as a lawyer. He was very successful as a trial lawyer prior to the Thorshaw versus Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company. But in that case, the L&N Railroad, in 1980, it was the largest personal injury verdict in history. And I assumed, well, Fred must have gotten that case because he had such a great reputation as a big-time lawyer. And it turns out that the reason he got the case instead of the other lawyers that were called by the plaintiff is actually far less dramatic. What happened?
Yes, it is. In the Thorshaw case, Dr. Thorshaw and his wife lived in Gull Point. It was a train derailment that spilled androgenous ammonia, which is incredibly toxic. It engulfed their house. They fled from the house. Both parents ended up dying. The two children ended up living. And when the grandparents came to town to try to seek justice, they called 3 or 4 lawyers, and Fred was the only one who returned their phone call. So he got the case.
That is absolutely hilarious because he returned the phone call. Something so simple, so obvious, and something, frankly, everybody should do, but only Fred did. And it puts him on the fast track to success. Now, he had never, at that point, he had won every jury trial that he had ever had up to that point. So it's not like he wasn't successful prior to that, but clearly you win a case like that and it's some serious money and serious prestige. Now, the other interesting thing about that case is that Fred was offered, or more technically inaccurately, the plaintiff was offered $2 million to settle that case. It was turned down, and the jury awarded $18 million, but ultimately, L&N Railroad paid $52 million. How did that figure triple?
It was a classic Fred Levin situation. He turns down the $2 million settlement because he thinks he can win the trial. He wins the trial, he gets the $18 million judgment. But what's going to happen now? Well, they're going to appeal. So this case is going to be strung out forever, and these 2 orphan children, forget the fact they don't need $18 million, but they're not going to get anything for a long time. So Fred came up with what's now very widely used in the business called a structured settlement, and it was really revolutionary then. He went to the railroad, and he said, look, I'll tell you what, if you put up $11.5 million, which was the present value of that money, and you buy an insurance policy and pay this out over time, you can settle the $18 million case for $11.5 million, but by paying it out over time, it ended up growing and compounding with interest to $52 million.
And it opened up this whole new area of law called structured settlements.
Yeah, that's correct. And now almost all of these settlements are structured now because the company that is penalized and has to pay whatever the amount the jury has decided can, in fact, buy a bond for a lot less. So they're paying a fraction of what they would pay, but then over time, because that money's paid out over time and collects interest, the plaintiffs, in fact, get more money. So it works out well for both sides.
And the other thing that really surprised me about those structured settlements is the tax consequences of them. Because under previous tax law, if you use the accrual accounting method, you have to pay taxes on income when it is billed, but not necessarily received. So Fred and the law firm would have had to pay this enormous tax bill on money they didn't even get yet. They actually would have paid more in taxes than they received in income, in the early years, I mean. And Fred somehow managed to get that changed.
There's a very interesting point. So they were to receive a $5 million fee. So Fred also structured their fee to be paid out $1 million a year for 5 years and $2 million at the end of 20 years. So what that did was it gave him an extra $1 million in a fee. They gave an extra $1 million overall, but because the money was compounding each year, it would continue to compound. However, the risk is that the IRS would say, well, you're entitled to the $5 million right now, so we're going to tax you on that. And had that happened, they would have only received the $1 million, and they would have been taxed on $5 million. But it turned out that the IRS let that through, and they agreed that the full amount of the attorney's fees were not taxable up front, but in fact over time. So it worked out well for Fred, and again, this is common practice now in the legal field.
And looking at that payout from the vantage point of today, where large verdicts against corporations are commonplace, it would be real easy to say that any lawyer would have won that case and that Fred Levin just got lucky by getting the case in the first place. But that's actually not true at all. Fred really did win a tough case, didn't he?
Yes, he did, and he did it by outworking the other side. I mean, the minute he took the case, his investigators were out there photographing the railroad tracks, showing where the fissures were, showing how the train derailed from the tracks. 5 hours after they were there, the railroad was fixing the tracks to try and cover up the case. But he and his investigators were already on the case. And he just simply outworks the other side. He went in and to all the minutia that are involved with these personal injury cases, calculating injury, calculating the loss of wages, calculating the damages, and convincingly, obviously, presented that to the jury.
All right, we're speaking with Josh Young. He's the author of the book, And Give Up Showbiz, a fascinating book about Fred Levin. We've got to take a quick break, but when we get back, we will continue our conversation. We're going to delve a little bit into Fred Levin's family life And this is a chapter that I knew nothing about. And if you haven't yet read this book, I think you are going to be, frankly, moved by what happened there. We're speaking with Josh Young. He's the author of the book, And Give Up Showbiz? How Fred Levin beat Big Tobacco, avoided 2 murder prosecutions, became a chief of Ghana, earned Boxing Manager of the Year, and transformed American law. The story of Fred Levin really is a fascinating one. You think you know it because, hey, you're here in Northwest Florida. This is where Fred's based out of. You think you know Fred Levin. I thought I knew Fred Levin until I read this book, and there was so much more to the story. All of it was fascinating, from his youth to his time at university to his time as a lawyer, the famous people that he has met. It really is a fascinating read, and I encourage you to buy it. This book is available, of course, online and at bookstores. So the name of the book again is And Give Up Showbiz, written by Josh Young. This book talks about Fred Levin as a lawyer, but it also talks about Fred Levin as a father and as a husband. Tell us about his family life.
Well, admittedly, Fred Levin was a lousy husband and a lousy father, and it's something that to this day, today he regrets, and he's come to regret. But at the time, he was far, far into himself. All he was concerned with was making money, going out drinking with the guys, going to cocktail parties, being the center of attention, having all this adulation rain down on him. And so he ignored his family. Of 13 graduations that all of his kids went through from high school all the way through law school, he only attended one of them. His wife at the time was suffering from what we now know as irritable bowel syndrome, but back then it was misdiagnosed by the doctors, and they weren't aware of this condition. And they told Fred that they said, this is all in her head. There's nothing wrong with her. So she was drinking, and she was trying to medicate, and he was saying, oh, you're just crazy. It's all in your head. And it turns out she had this horrible disease, and he didn't handle it well, and he was not a good husband to her and not a good father. And it's something, again, that later in life, when he started to examine his life from a personal standpoint, that he really came to regret.
Well, I was very surprised at how open and honest the Home Sweet Home chapter about his family life was. There was no glossing over the bad parts, no hiding the negative. It was real. It was raw. And when Marilyn died, I actually cried. Seriously. I read the book while on a trip with my youngest son, and he was sitting in the seat next to me on the plane. And he looked at me all confused and asked, why are you teared up? And Josh, I couldn't answer him. So he then asked, he says, did someone in the book die? He had no clue what I was reading, but he said, did someone in the book die? And all I could do was nod my head. And I don't cry easily. I couldn't believe it. And then, once I blinked away enough tears to keep reading, I read the excerpt from the eulogy that Martin Levin gave at the funeral, and the tears welled up again. I was like, what the hell's wrong with me? I never met Marilyn, and I'd only met Fred a few times, very casually. He'd have no reason to remember me or to even know that I existed an hour later, if that long. I suppose it was just a very powerful chapter that really moved me. So, having said that, and having just embarrassed myself on the radio by admitting that I cried over a book, tell us Fred Levin's perspective on his role as a husband and as a father.
Well, his perspective at the time was his job was to provide for the family and make as much money as possible, and he did that. The family wanted for nothing. Marilyn, even when his wife was sick, wanted for nothing. She had around-the-clock care. She had everything that she could possibly want. He also showered her with gifts because he felt that he's the wealthy guy, he's the big man about town. She should have these incredible gifts. He bought her a $500,000 sapphire necklace. She never wore it. She didn't care about that. She didn't care about wealth and social status. She cared about human beings and connecting with human beings. And she treated everyone the same, and he learned to treat everyone the same, I think, because of her. But these things that didn't matter to her, that mattered to him, drove them apart. As Fred would say, someone asked him asked her why she's married for so long. He said, well, he was in love with himself, and she was in love with him too, so they were both in love with the same man. But part of it's funny, but it's also very tragic. The most tragic thing is that going through all this stuff that she didn't care about, that he was showering on her, and he's basking in his own success, it turns out after she died, they found dozens and dozens of or just before she died, rather, dozens of scrapbooks that she had been keeping, clips of every single case he won. And it turned out that she was his biggest fan, and he didn't even know it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing that is interesting about that is that the marriage between Fred and Marilyn, it's kind of surprising it ever even happened in the first place. While they met at the University of Florida, their first date did not go so well for Fred. What happened?
Well, Marilyn was a beautiful, beautiful woman, and everyone wanted to go out with her. So a friend of Fred's said, I'm going to get you a date with the most beautiful woman you've ever met. So he introduces Fred to Marilyn, and he's like, you're absolutely right. This woman is incredible. And he says to Marilyn, will you go out with me? And she looks at her calendar, and she says, how about 3 Thursdays from tomorrow? She was booked up. Everyone wanted to go out with her. So finally the first date rolls around, and Fred's thinking, I've got no chance. She's going out with all these hotshot guys. So Fred gets drunk on the date and tries to seduce her through hypnotism. It doesn't go very well. And, the funny thing is, as bad as his behavior was, it became this sort of cause celeb of hers, personal cause celeb, that she wanted to tame this crazy party guy. And that is where the attraction developed.
It was a fascinating chapter, and as I said, it was also very tragic. I mean, when I said that I shed tears, and I don't want to imply that I was, crying like a baby, where people 3 rows down in the aircraft were thinking, "What's wrong with that guy?" But tears were dripping down my cheeks onto the pages of the book, and that does not happen easily. And what really hit me, Josh, were Marilyn's final words to Fred. What were they?
Look, Marilyn was an incredible woman, and she went through this horrible, horrible sickness, and all she wanted to live was this simple life. All she wanted to do was for this man to love her, and that never happened. And right before they died, she looked up at him as she was being wheeled out to the hospital where she would die a few days later, and she looked at Fred and she said, "Tell me you love me." And he said, "Of course I love you."
That's what did it to me. It's all she wanted. She just wanted to know that he did in fact love her, and he did in fact love her. It was a very moving...
In his own way, he absolutely did. And one of the things in doing the book when we started talking about this was he would tell me some of these stories, and I would just say, boy, that's tough. That's kind of horrible. And he says, yeah, that's the truth. And he said, I want people to read this, so I want them to see that it's not all about making money and being successful and being famous. The family's very important, and don't end up like me. Don't end up regretting how you treated your wife and how you treated your family.
Well, that's part of what I think makes this book so fascinating, is that it's not just the good side of the story. I have to admit, Josh, when I started reading this book, thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to interview Josh because, Fred Levin is a local guy from Pensacola. This is something that would be of interest to the audience. I get about a third of the way through the book, and I'm having second thoughts thinking, if I interview Josh, Fred's going to sue me for defamation. But it turns out Fred cooperated with the entire book. And so, since he cooperated, I guess I'm off the hook for defamation and libel, huh? It's all true.
Yes, I hope I am as well.
Well, truth is an absolute defense. And so if it's all true, it's all true. But I just remember reading it thinking,
true.
Fred's going to sue me if I go on the air with this stuff. But hey, I'm just very surprised that it was in the book. But that's part of what makes it such a fascinating read. We're talking to Josh Young. He wrote the book, And Give Up Showbiz, How Fred Levin Beat Big Tobacco, Avoided 2 Murder Prosecutions, Became a Chief of Ghana, Earned Boxing Manager of the Year, and Transformed American Law. Going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will continue the conversation with Josh Young. I'm going to talk some more about Fred's fascinating life outside of law. He did a whole lot there, too. We'll discuss that in just a moment. I am talking to Josh Young, the author of the book, And Give Up Showbiz? It's a fascinating read about attorney Fred Levin. Josh, how did Fred Levin end up managing the career of Roy Jones Jr., who was arguably the best pound-for-pound boxer in history?
Roy Jones Jr., as everyone knows, was from Pensacola, and in the 1988 Olympics, he was robbed of a gold medal and given the silver medal because the judges had been paid under the table. one day, Roy Jones Sr., when Roy Jones Jr. was going to now turn professional after the Olympics, Roy Jones Sr. walked into Fred Levin's office and he said, "I want you to represent my son." And Fred said, "That's fascinating. Oh, my gosh." He said, "But I don't know anything about boxing." And Roy Jones Sr. said, "That's exactly why I want you to represent him."
And Fred only got $100,000 per fight with Roy? That's a pittance. Why so little?
Yeah, when you look at the type of money that, let's say, Don King was making, that is a pittance. Because Fred did it for other reasons. Fred did it because Fred wanted to be in front of the camera after the fight. When Roy won and the HBO cameras were there, he wanted the publicity. He wanted to have his name put out there in this arena. And to him, the publicity was worth $100 million. So he really didn't care that much about what he was earning from this because, again, it was rubbing off in free publicity.
Mm-hmm. And so what about Ghana's Ike Corte? How did Fred get involved with him?
Well, Ike Corte liken him to the Michael Jordan of Ghana. He was a boxer, and he was earning something in the neighborhood of $50,000 a fight. It's not well below what he was worth. And he took on Ike Corte because he was representing other boxers. And through this, he ended up meeting members of the Ghana royal family. And they were very grateful for the work that he did for Corte because Corte was sort of an ambassador, a sports ambassador for their country. And in getting to know Fred, they also learned about his record with helping African Americans, winning trials for African Americans, and the country of Ghana later named him a chief of Ghana, which is a very, very high honor. Fred's only one of 3 Americans who were named the chief of Ghana. The other 2 were Shirley Temple Black and Congresswoman Barbara Jordan of Texas.
Yeah, that there is a fascinating story to be royalty in another country, a country lawyer from Pensacola. It's really amazing. Well, let's talk a little bit now about Fred's gambling activities and how that got him into trouble with the Florida bar. What happened?
Well, there was a lot of jealousy in the Florida bar to Fred Levin's success, and part of that was Fred brought on himself by being such a flamboyant self-promoter. In 1986, Dean Baird was arrested and charged with running an 80-person gambling ring and was indicted. At that point, Fred feels that the bar was really out to get him. So the Florida bar came after him for gambling, which is a misdemeanor. Fred admitted that he was betting on football games on television, on Blab TV, his cable network that he had formed. And the bar said, "That's a misdemeanor. You admitted, we're coming after you." Well, it was ridiculous. He was $100 here, $100 there. It was a time when even the governor of Florida used to bet with the governor of Georgia. They'd bet a crate of oranges against a crate of peaches on a football game. So it was a very, very technical thing, but Fred felt the bar was out to get him, and they tried to disbar him for that offense. In the course of that investigation, as Dean Baird told me, they came to Dean and they said, "Look, we know you're not behind this gambling ring. We know Fred Levin is." And that just, it's my understanding, that just wasn't the case. And Dean said these people in authority would come to him and they would say, "Look, we want you to give us anything that'll put Fred Levin in jail." So it was kind of a witch hunt that didn't go anywhere because Dean Baird refused to do that.
Well, after Dean Baird got out of prison, he lived in a very, lavish suite at Fred Levin's home, which caused a lot of people to think that Dean Baird took the fall for Fred Levin. Is there any truth to that theory?
I don't believe so, and I'm sure Dean could address that. But, Dean was a close friend of Fred's, and, Dean had made a lot of, as Fred says in the book, he'd mistreated people who were lower than him. He'd made a lot of enemies himself, and he would flaunt the money he was making. And so he, as Fred says, his attitude was his downfall. But he was still a friend of Fred. So when he got out and he needed a leg up, Fred gave him one. And, that's just something that Fred will do anytime, even if the appearance of something is bad. If he thinks it's the right thing to do, he'll do it.
So the Florida bar got onto Fred over his gambling, admitting that he did it. And, of course, there were other attorneys, too, who all just accepted, if you will, a plea bargain to the bar.
And they all accepted plea deals, and Fred refused.
Right. Yeah, so Fred was standing his ground and ultimately prevailed. But then the Florida bar got onto him again, and the next time the reason was even more, quote, ridiculous than the gambling charge. So what was ridiculous about the next time the bar went after him?
Fred was trying a case, and in the case, he was giving his closing argument. And he said the best way to determine how substantial this case is to look at the extent of the lawyers on the other side are trying to convince you what I consider to be ridiculous testimony. And the defense witnesses are trying to sell you a bill of goods, and I think you should be very harsh and award my client a lot of money. Well, the bar went after him for influencing the jury with the word ridiculous. They said that by saying that, he had prejudiced the jury, and they ended up bringing him up on charges for that.
And what's so interesting about that from a technical analysis of appellate law is that the word ridiculous was never objected to at trial. So I don't really understand how anybody could complain since an appellate court is supposed to deal with objections.
The other side didn't object, and the judge didn't say anything at trial. So again, it was something that people who didn't like Fred Levin, were jealous of his success, drug up in an effort to tear him down.
And by using that
word, I believe his son said he was the first person in the history of jurisprudence to have charges brought against him over statements in a trial that weren't even objected to at the trial.
Right. And then, in typical Fred Levin serendipity, the verdict in the retrial of the Rawson case, which got thrown out because of the statement, the word ridiculous, the retrial resulted in a $31 million judgment, and the original verdict that was tossed out was only $7.88 million. So he lost on appeal, and then he quadrupled it.
Thank you very much for making me retry this case, because I just quadrupled my winnings.
Amazing. Absolutely an amazing story. All right, well, the other big thing that Fred Levin is known for, and what has given him such international acclaim within the legal profession, is that he managed to beat Big Tobacco, get a $13.2 billion settlement, and his share of the $3.4 billion in lawyer fees. What is that story?
When there were some plaintiffs' lawyers in the country who wanted to go after Big Tobacco for the harm that they had caused people for smoking and the cost that the states had paid out to Medicaid patients, Fred was asked to take on Florida, and he refused. He said, Big Tobacco's never paid a nickel. They're not going to pay now. I'm not spending any money on this. He went back to Pensacola and started browsing through some law books, and he discovered a really arcane statute, the Third Party Recovery Act. And he figured out that if he could just rewrite a few words of this, that this could be applied to Big Tobacco, that the state could stand in the shoes of all the smokers, that they could sue the tobacco companies based on their market share, and they would have to pay out based on their market share. So Fred rewrote this law. At the time, he was special counsel to W.D. Childers, who was the president of the Florida Senate. He went to Lawton Childs and said, look, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to apply this to Big Tobacco, and we're going to sue. And Lawton Childs said, I'm 100% behind it. Those guys hooked me on cigarettes. Let's get them. So W.D. Childers passed this law that Fred wrote in the middle of the night on the last day of the spring session on a voice vote. The statute that Fred rewrote didn't mention Big Tobacco, so nobody saw this coming until a couple of weeks later when they started putting together the lawsuit, and then all hell broke loose.
And it was almost repealed. The law was almost repealed.
Yes, well, Big Tobacco immediately challenged the law in the courts. It ultimately went all the way up through the courts of the Supreme Court, and the law was upheld. At the same time, they began leaning on the Florida legislature to overturn the law, and they came within one vote of getting the law overturned. But because the law was not overturned and because it was upheld by the Supreme Court, the case would have moved forward against Big Tobacco, and Big Tobacco saw the writing on the wall and ended up, in fact, settling the case, as you said, for $13 billion. That became the platform that every other state used to settle with Big Tobacco, which resulted in the global $260 billion settlement that Big Tobacco's had to pay out.
What an incredible life. All right, we don't have a whole lot of time left, Josh Young, but real quick, because it is part of the book here, how did Fred Levin manage to avoid 2 murder prosecutions?
Well, I'm going to have to say you'll need to go to your local bookstore or Amazon and buy a copy of And Give Up Showbiz, because those are complicated situations.
Well,
in brief, one of them occurred in the Gulf Power situation of Jay Corden, the Gulf Power case of Jay Corden. Fred was representing Gulf Power as the lawyer, and Jay Corden felt he was being scapegoated by the parent company for some tax charges that they were under. He found out he was going to be fired. So he came to Fred's office, talked to Fred, and then said, I'm going to fly to Atlanta to consult with the CEO of the parent company. And
Josh, let me jump in right now and just say, Josh, you know what? We got to run. Time's up. But listen, people are just going to have to buy the book, because the story of that is fascinating, and we've only scratched the surface of other very interesting stories in this book. So I encourage you to buy the book. It's titled And Give Up Showbiz, written by Josh Young, and it's available wherever books are sold, either online or in bookstores.